Ethan Caldwell parked his luxury car 2 blocks from the mirrored building that housed the foundation bearing his name. The clock read 8:40 a.m., but the street was already crowded. Hurried mothers, street vendors, children with backpacks far too big for their small bodies. It was all too common a scene for someone whose routine usually took place between glass-walled offices, airports, and silent meetings where numbers decided destinies. He got out of the car, adjusting his jacket, his cell phone vibrating with notifications he ignored. Something about that morning bothered him, a vague feeling, like when you realize you've forgotten something important but can't quite remember what it was. As he was crossing the sidewalk, that's when he saw it. At first it was just a familiar silhouette. A woman standing near the crosswalk, holding a little girl's hand while trying to restrain a restless younger boy who was tugging at her jacket. Her brown hair was simply tied back, her body slimmer than Ethan remembered. But the way she spoke, that specific way of tilting her head when listening to someone, was unmistakable. Laura. The name flashed through his mind with enough force to make him stop in the middle of the sidewalk. People walked past him, some muttering, but Ethan didn't move. His eyes were fixed on her, as if the world around him had been reduced to that scene. Laura looked tired. Not the elegant tiredness you see in magazines, but a real weariness, evident in her slightly hunched shoulders and the way she took a deep breath before speaking to the children. The girl must have been about 8 years old, the boy, perhaps 5. Both had eyes that were far too attentive for their age. Ethan felt his stomach clench. It had been 11 years since he'd seen her. 11 years since the last day Laura left the small apartment they shared in San Diego, carrying only a suitcase, a hardened face, and words he refused to hear. Back then, he wasn't yet the man featured in business magazines. He was ambitious, yes, but broken, obsessed with an idea that consumed everything around him, including her. He remembered the sound of the door closing. He remembered returning to the computer minutes later, convinced he was doing the right thing. Now, there she was. Right in front of him, with 2 children. The woman crossed the street as the light turned red for cars. Ethan didn't realize the traffic light had changed. He only came to his senses when a horn sounded behind him. He took a step back, his heart racing, and then did something he hadn't done in years. He hesitated. Laura stopped in front of a small bakery across the street. The girl let go of her hand and ran to the window, pointing to something inside. The boy spoke quickly, gesturing wildly, and Laura crouched down to his level, gently holding his face as she said something Ethan couldn't hear. The gesture was like a blow. It was an intimate, automatic gesture, a mother's gesture. Ethan felt his throat go dry. His mind, trained for quick, logical decisions, began to trace possibilities he didn't want to complete. He silently calculated dates he'd never connected before. 11 years. 11. He took 2 steps toward the street, then stopped again. Part of him wanted to cross the street, call her name, demand answers. Another part, larger than he cared to admit, wanted to run away, go inside the building, pretend none of this was happening. But fate gave him no choice. Laura looked up. For a second, her eyes passed right over him. The next, they stopped. Her body stiffened, as if the air had been ripped from her lungs. The hand that held the boy's squeezed slightly, and the girl noticed the change in her mother's face, turning curiously to see what had caught her attention. The recognition was immediate. There was no confusion, no doubt, just that silent expression of someone who finds a past they thought was buried. Ethan didn't smile. He didn't wave. He stood there, motionless, while the distance between them seemed to narrow without either of them moving. Laura was the first to react. She straightened her shoulders, took a deep breath and looked away, as if he were just another stranger on the street. She took the girl's hand, called the children over, and turned to go into the bakery. Impulse overcame reason. Laura. The word came out softly, but laden with something he couldn't even name. She stopped. She didn't turn around immediately. The silence that followed was heavy, almost palpable. When she finally looked back, her face was composed, but her eyes betrayed everything her posture had tried to hide. "Ethan," she said simply. There was no hug. There was no smile. Just two worlds that had followed opposite paths colliding again, in the middle of an ordinary street, under the watchful gaze of two children who observed everything in silence. Ethan looked at them, at their hair, their features, the way the boy instinctively positioned himself in front of his sister. Something inside it broke. That was no ordinary coincidence. He felt it with disturbing clarity. The presence of those children was not a detail, it was a warning. A past he had ignored was now standing before him, demanding to be acknowledged. Laura gripped the bakery doorknob tightly, as if she were about to run away. Ethan began, but stopped. For the first time in many years, he didn't know what to say. She watched him for far too long a moment, then spoke with a calmness that seemed rehearsed by life. "Some things can no longer be avoided, Ethan, only postponed." And she went inside, leaving him outside, alone, with a growing and frightening certainty. That morning would change everything. Ethan stood for a few seconds in front of the bakery, observing the distorted reflection of himself in the glass. The man staring back at him had firm features, a confident posture, the kind of presence that made people make way for each other in the aisles. Nothing in that reflection betrayed the turmoil brewing inside. He went in. The smell of warm bread and fresh coffee contrasted sharply with the immediately settled atmosphere inside. Laura sat at a table near the wall, the children beside her. The girl swung her legs as she examined a muffin. The boy kept his eyes fixed on the wall, alternating between his mother and Ethan, as if assessing an unseen threat. Laura didn't invite him to sit down. She didn't need to. Ethan pulled out the chair in front of her, mindful of every movement, as if any wrong move could make everything crumble. The silence stretched for a few seconds. It wasn't awkward, it was heavy, a silence of unspoken things, of years compressed into a few square meters. "You're different," Laura finally said. There was no judgment in her voice, only observation. Ethan nodded slightly. "You too." It was true. The woman in front of him was no longer the young woman who dreamed of travel and a simple life while he talked about startups and investors. There was a firmness in her now, a resilience that hadn't existed before, something forged by necessity. Laura introduced the children. "This is Emma and Lucas." Ethan repeated the names mentally. Emma smiled politely. Lucas just watched him, too serious for someone his age. "They are polite," Ethan commented, trying to sound neutral. "They learned early," Laura replied. The phrase fell between them like a door closing. Ethan's world had always been controlled. He grew up in rural Oregon, the son of a mechanic who had taught him from an early age that effort didn't guarantee reward, but it was the only currency available. When he moved to California, he carried this mentality like armor. He built his company on sleepless nights, cold decisions, and the conviction that feelings were distractions. Laura was the exception he had tried to fit into the impossible logic of his ambition. She, in turn, came from an ordinary East Coast family, where family lunches were sacred and success wasn't measured in numbers. She moved to San Diego believing that love and growth could coexist. For years she tried. She adjusted, she compromised, she waited, until the day she realized she was alone within her own relationship. Now, sitting there, Laura watched Ethan with a mixture of vigilance and resignation. She knew exactly who he had become. The headlines, the awards, the interviews. It had all reached her, even when she had tried to avoid it. "I never thought I'd find you like this," he said finally. "I thought so," she replied. "I just didn't think it would be here." Ethan looked around. The simple bakery, the ordinary people coming and going, the cashier calling out names, that was her reality. A world far removed from his own. "Do you live around here?" he asked. "A few years ago?" And he hesitated, looking at the children again. Their father? Laura did not look away. It's not part of our lives. The answer was direct, but not enlightening. Ethan felt the weight of it. Every detail she avoided confirming made the suspicion more concrete. Laura finished her coffee, wiped her hands with a napkin, and stood up. I need to go. Can we talk? He asked, too quickly. She took a deep breath before answering. Talking doesn't change the past, Ethan. But can you explain the gift? Her eyes met his. There was a moment of vulnerability there, brief, almost imperceptible. Maybe, she said. But not today. She picked up the children's backpacks, helping them to their feet. Emma waved to Ethan. Lucas didn't. Laura stopped beside him before leaving. If you really want to understand, she said in a low voice, you'll need to be prepared to hear things you won't like. And then he was gone. Ethan sat there as the world returned to its normal rhythm. But for him, nothing seemed normal anymore. The encounter hadn't just been an emotional shock, it had been a crack in everything he thought he controlled. As he left the bakery, the foundation building seemed smaller, the achievements quieter. For the first time in a long time, Ethan realized there was a part of life his success had never reached. And now, this part was demanding answers. Ethan couldn't concentrate for the rest of the day. Meetings passed like noise. Charts projected on the wall mingled with the persistent images of two children sitting before him, of Laura holding Lucas's backpack with almost instinctive care. He signed documents without reading them, answered questions automatically, and dismissed his team earlier than usual. Late in the afternoon, he made a decision he had been avoiding ever since the bakery. He ordered an investigation. It wasn't an impulsive choice, it was practical. Ethan had always solved problems this way. A short call to Martin Hayes, his legal director and longtime confidant, was all it took. I need information, Ethan said dryly, discreetly. Martin didn't ask about what. He simply replied, how long, as quickly as possible. Hours later, back home, Ethan stared at the panoramic view of Los Angeles without truly seeing it. The apartment at the top of the building was too quiet. It had always been that way, but that night the silence felt accusatory. Your phone vibrated. I have something. Can we talk now? Martin's message said. Minutes later, the call was answered. Laura Bennett left San Diego 11 years ago, Martin began. She moved to Colorado for a while. She worked 2 different jobs. There are no marriage records, no alimony proceedings. Ethan closed his eyes. The children? There was a brief pause. Emma was born 9 months after your separation. The air seemed to leave his lungs. And the boy? Lucas was born 3 years later. Ethan rested his hand on the table. Logic screamed at him what he still refused to say aloud. The declared father, not listed. The silence that followed was heavy. Are you sure? Ethan asked, his voice lower. The records are clear. If you want, a test can confirm it. Ethan ended the call without answering. That night, he didn't sleep. He thought about every ignored conversation, every time Laura had asked for more time, more attention. He thought about their last argument, when she had mentioned something about not raising a child alone, and he had responded irritably, accusing her of dramatizing. The phrase returned like a cruel echo. The next day, Ethan did something even more out of the ordinary. He went back to that street. He waited. Laura appeared shortly before 3 in the afternoon, the children beside her. This time, when she saw him, she didn't seem surprised, just tired. I figured you'd come back, she said. We need to talk. She hesitated, but agreed. They sat on a nearby bench, away from the hustle and bustle. The children played a few meters away, always under her watchful eye. I didn't come here to demand anything, Ethan began. Just to understand. Laura observed Emma and Lucas before speaking. Do you remember your last month in San Diego? He nodded vaguely. I found out I was pregnant 2 weeks after I left, she continued. I tried to call you more than once. Ethan's stomach clenched. You never left a message because he never answered. She didn't say that in anger, just as a fact. When I realized you weren't coming back, I made a decision. I raised my daughter alone. And Lucas? He asked, his voice almost a whisper. Laura took a while to reply. Lucas is yours too. The world seemed to slow down. Ethan looked at the boy, who at that moment was running after his sister, laughing. The laughter sounded distant, as if it came from underwater. Why didn't you ever tell me? He asked. Because you had already chosen a life without us, Laura replied, and I chose not to beg. The words weren't meant to hurt, but they hurt nonetheless. I didn't know, Ethan said, as if that could absolve him of anything. But I could have known, she replied. The conflict was exposed, naked and irreversible. It was no longer a matter of the past or resentment, but of something alive, running a few meters ahead, oblivious to the storm it was causing. Ethan realized with painful clarity that his greatest achievement lay not in the buildings that bore his name, but in the time he could never recover. And now he would have to decide what to do with the truth that had finally caught up with him. In the days that followed, the revelation began to shape every decision Ethan made, even as he tried to pretend he was still in control of his own routine. The foundation continued to operate, investments yielded returns, meetings took place, but everything seemed to occur on the fringes of something bigger, more urgent, that now demanded attention. He requested a DNA test. He didn't do it in secret. He told Laura directly, in a short, almost perfunctory phone call. I need confirmation, he stated. I understand, she replied. Just don't confuse that with permission to enter their lives without limits. The condition was clear. The test would be done discreetly, without emotionally involving the children until the result was definitive. Laura had accepted, not out of trust, but out of a need to end that story once and for all. While they waited, new tensions emerged. At the company, Martin began warning him about risks that went beyond the personal ones. If this leaks, the lawyer said, the press will exploit it. A billionaire with unrecognized children makes for dangerous headlines. Ethan realized that for the first time, his public image was not armor, but a threat. Protecting Laura and the children meant, paradoxically, confronting the very empire he had built. On the other hand, Laura faced different dilemmas. Ethan's presence had sparked questions among the children. Emma, more perceptive, had noticed the change in her mother's behavior. Lucas had become quieter, observing the world with the distrust of someone who senses something is wrong, but doesn't know how to name it. Who is that man? Emma asked one night. Laura took a while to reply. Someone who was a part of my life, she said, choosing each word carefully. Is he coming back? The question remained unanswered. In addition, Laura was dealing with practical pressures. Her job at the local school paid enough to survive, but not enough for unexpected expenses. The rent had recently increased. There were outstanding medical bills from a fall Lucas had suffered months before. Accepting Ethan's help meant opening a door she had closed with great effort. Meanwhile, a figure from the past quietly resurfaced, Nathan Reed, Laura's former classmate in Colorado. He had been the one to help her in her early years, offering emotional support and never overstepping boundaries. Now, upon learning of Ethan's return to her life, Nathan showed concern, not out of jealousy, but out of caution. People like him don't come in slowly, Nathan said on the phone. They take over everything. Laura knew he was right. The test arrived on a rainy morning. Ethan received the results alone in his office, his hands trembling slightly, something that hadn't happened in decades. Compatibility confirmed. Both minors are their biological children. The truth, now official, brought no relief. It brought responsibility. He called Laura immediately. I'll take responsibility, he said, the right way, but I want to do it while respecting you. There was silence on the other end. "Taking responsibility isn't just about paying bills, Ethan," she replied. "It's about being present, and that you never knew how to do." The subplots converged. Media pressure, Laura's fear, the emotional impact on the children, the conflict between power and fatherhood, each thread intertwined, making any simple decision impossible. Ethan understood that the real challenge wasn't proving he was the father. That had already been done. The challenge was to prove that he deserved to be. Ethan decided to make his presence concrete in a way that didn't involve contracts, checks, or lawyers. For the first time, he asked for something simple: time. Not with Laura, with the children. The proposal was made cautiously. A short meeting in a neutral space without promises or difficult explanations. Laura agreed after days of hesitation, setting clear limits. An afternoon in the park. No photos, no speeches. The park was just a few blocks from the school. Tall trees, benches worn from use, children running around oblivious to the adult dramas unfolding around them. Ethan arrived early, without a driver, without security. He wore jeans and a simple t-shirt, something he hadn't worn outside the house in years. When Laura arrived, Emma was the first to recognize him. "It's him," she said softly, holding her brother's hand. Lucas simply frowned. Ethan crouched down to their level, remembering how Laura had always done it. "Hi," he said. "I'm Ethan. I didn't say your father. Not yet." The afternoon passed in a strangely normal way. They played ball. They ate ice cream. Ethan learned that Emma liked astronomy and that Lucas was afraid of heights, but pretended not to be. Every detail seemed like a belated privilege. Laura watched from a distance, her heart torn between vigilance and a hope she refused to admit. The decisive moment came without warning. Lucas fell off his bicycle. Nothing serious, just a scratch on his knee, but the fright was enough to make him cry. Laura stood up immediately, but Ethan got there first. He carefully picked up the boy, wiped the blood with a handkerchief, and spoke softly, firmly, without panic. Lucas stopped crying. "Aren't you going to leave?" he asked suddenly. The question hit Ethan like a blow. "Not today," he replied, "and I hope I won't be going any time soon." Lucas stared at him for a few seconds, assessing the promise. Then he nodded as if accepting a provisional agreement. That's where everything changed. That night, Laura received an unexpected call. "We need to talk," Martin said, his voice tense. "Someone leaked the information." The following day, news websites featured carefully worded yet unequivocal headlines. "Billionaire businessman confirms fatherhood outside of marriage." Cameras appeared near the school. Paparazzi circled Laura's building. What had been fragile became dangerous. Ethan showed up at her house that same night, his face burdened with grief. "This has gotten out of control," he said. "If they stay here, they'll become targets." "I'm not going to run away," Laura replied. "My life can't be packed up again because of you." "Then let me face this alone," he said. "But I won't let them hurt you." The public revelation wasn't just a scandal, it was the ultimate test. Ethan had to choose between protecting his image and protecting his family. For the first time, the choice was immediate. The following morning, he called a press conference. On camera, he took full responsibility. He didn't shirk responsibility. He didn't shift blame. He spoke of responsibility, of mistakes, of learning from them. He announced that he was temporarily stepping away from the company to prioritize his family. The impact was seismic. That gesture didn't erase the past, but it reshaped the future. For Laura, for the children, and for Ethan himself, nothing would ever be the same again. The man who had always controlled the narrative had relinquished control, and that was the real turning point. The press conference reverberated for days. Analysts discussed the impact on the markets, columnists were divided on Ethan's stance, and television programs explored every possible detail of the story. For the public, it was just another corporate scandal with human undertones. For Laura and the children, it was a daily intrusion. The school needed to increase security. Emma started arriving earlier to avoid questions. Lucas began to withdraw, answering with monosyllables, observing adults with renewed distrust. Ethan quickly realized that coming out publicly didn't mean he knew how to deal with the personal consequences. He tried to get closer, but now every gesture was analyzed, every visit was noticed. Laura, though grateful for the protection he offered, felt the weight of the exposure. "You decided to take on the world," she said one night. "But you brought the world to us." He kept the phrase. To mitigate the damage, Ethan rented a discreet house in a quiet neighborhood, far from the city center. Not to isolate Laura, but to offer her a choice. She hesitated, but eventually accepted temporarily, once again imposing her own boundaries. Meanwhile, the company reacted. Some investors withdrew, others showed support. The board pressured Ethan to resume his position, concerned about the instability. He refused, something unthinkable months before. "For the first time," he told Martin, "there is something more important than keeping everything standing." The decision came at a cost, financial, reputational, and personal. In his closest circle, reactions were mixed. Former allies questioned his lucidity. People who never forgave him for his estrangement now demanded access, as if fatherhood were a password to invade his life. Laura watched everything cautiously. "You don't need to destroy yourself to prove anything," she said. "Not to me, not to them." Ethan understood that his actions needed to stop being grandiose and start being consistent. With the children, it started small. Picking them up from school, helping with homework, being present without making announcements. Emma began asking questions about the place, curious about how he explained things with unexpected patience. Lucas started waiting for him at the window without admitting it, but the accumulated emotional weight was taking its toll. One night, Laura found Ethan sitting exhausted in the dark room. "I thought I knew how to handle pressure," he said, "but this is different." "Because it matters now," she replied. The consequences weren't just external. Ethan was relearning how to exist outside of the role of control. Laura, in turn, struggled with the fear of depending again on someone who had already disappointed her. Both were being forced to react, to adapt, to redefine boundaries. And although chaos was still present, something was beginning to form beneath the surface. Not complete confidence, but possibility. The adaptation wasn't immediate. Each small advance was accompanied by silent retreats, as if everyone feared that any misstep could destroy the fragile balance that was beginning to form. Ethan felt this intensely. The constant presence of the children forced him to confront not only the father he was trying to become, but the man he had been. He began attending counseling sessions, something he had never admitted he needed. He didn't tell anyone except Laura, and even then he did so quietly. "It's not weakness," she said when he mentioned it. "It's responsibility." Gradually, Ethan learned to listen without correcting, to ask without directing. He discovered that Lucas needed predictability more than enthusiasm, and that Emma valued honest explanations, even when they weren't complete. A Saturday morning marked a silent advance. Emma was going to a science fair at school. Laura needed to work that day. Ethan offered to accompany his daughter. He didn't make speeches, he didn't buy anything extravagant. He just arrived on time, sat in the makeshift audience, and applauded when she presented her project on constellations visible in the Northern Hemisphere. Emma searched for his gaze during the presentation. He was there. Lucas, in turn, began to test the limits. Small provocations, refusals to obey, indirect questions about absences. "Are you leaving too?" she asked one night without looking at him. Ethan responded, without making any grand promises, "I'll be here tomorrow." The boy nodded, as if that answer was sufficient for the time being. Laura observed these interactions with critical attention. Part of her remained alert, but another part, more weary, was beginning to recognize real changes. Ethan didn't try to buy the children's affection. He didn't present himself as a savior. He was present, constantly, almost discreetly. Laura's growth was also silent. She resumed old plans, enrolled in a specialization course, and reconsidered possibilities she had set aside for survival. The fear of depending on Ethan still existed, but now it was accompanied by a conscious sense of independence. Their relationship transformed. There was no hasty romanticization. There was respect, difficult conversations, clear boundaries. The past wasn't rewritten. It was acknowledged. A simple moment sealed this phase. On an ordinary evening during dinner, Lucas spoke without lifting his head from his plate. "You can stay." It wasn't a request, it was permission. Ethan felt the weight of that sentence more than any contract he had ever signed. The overcoming didn't come from grand gestures, but from consistent repetition. The growth wasn't spectacular, it was genuine, and this was new for all of them. As the months passed, life began to find a less fragile rhythm. It wasn't complete stability, it was something more honest. A balance built day after day, sustained by small but consistent decisions. Ethan no longer lived divided between two worlds. He hadn't officially returned to the company yet, but he participated remotely, delegating tasks, declining invitations to public events. The attention that was once sought by shareholders was now directed towards school schedules, medical appointments, and nights when Lucas insisted he stay a few more minutes in his room before going to sleep. However, the calm was deceptive. Martin started calling frequently again. The board was pressing for a clear definition. Ethan's prolonged absence was beginning to create real instability, and some key investors were threatening to withdraw if he didn't reassume control. "They want you back," Martin said, "but not the way you are now." Ethan understood the subtext. They wanted the man from before, the cold, available strategist, fully committed to the empire. At the same time, Laura received an unexpected offer. A permanent position in the school's pedagogical coordination. The position meant more stability, but also more exposure, and the need to remain in that city, even if it complicated her current arrangements. Decisions piled up, pushing everyone to a point of no return. Emma, sensitive to change, sensed the tension even before the adults spoke. One night, while watching the sky through the window, she asked, "Are things going to change again?" Ethan did not respond immediately. "Some things change," he said finally. "Others, we choose to keep." Lucas, on the other hand, reacted differently. He became more attached to Laura, as if anticipating an invisible rupture. Small signs emerged, regressions in behavior, difficulty sleeping, prolonged silences. Laura felt the weight of the decision drawing near. "I don't want them to pay for choices they didn't make," I told Ethan. "Neither yours nor mine." The definitive conversation took place on a rainy night when the house seemed too small for everything that wasn't being said. "If you go back to that life," Laura stated, "it changes us, whether you admit it or not." "And if I don't come back," he replied, "I lose everything I've built." She stared at him intently. "Perhaps you need to decide what you've actually built." The subplots were beginning to wrap up. Nathan, realizing his role was no longer needed, discreetly withdrew. Martin made it clear that this would be the last chance to negotiate with the board. The school awaited Laura's response. Everything converged. There was no more room for delays. The choices that would be made now would not only affect reputations or careers, they would definitively shape the future of that newly formed family. The silence that settled between them was not empty. It was the harbinger of the final confrontation between who Ethan had been and who he was becoming. The decision was required sooner than Ethan expected. One Monday morning, Martin called before 7. His voice, normally controlled, was tense. "The board has moved the vote forward. Today," If you are not present, they will appoint a new interim CEO with full powers." Ethan hung up without answering. He sat at the kitchen table, watching Laura prepare the children's breakfast. Emma was talking about a math test. Lucas was complaining about his shoelace. The scene was simple, common, and for that very reason devastatingly clear. That was where his real life was now happening. "You're going," Laura said, without turning her face away. It wasn't a question. Ethan took a deep breath. "I'll go, but not in the way they expect." Inside the company building, the atmosphere was electric. Investors, advisors, executives, everyone awaited the man who, for years, had been the absolute synonym for control. When Ethan entered the room, the murmurs ceased. He listened to reports, projections, warnings. Then he stood up. "I didn't come back to resume things as they were before," he said. "I came back to redefine." There were immediate protests. One of the council members was blunt. "You're putting feelings above the company." Ethan nodded. "I'm prioritizing responsibility over ego." Then he did the unthinkable. He announced his definitive departure from the CEO position. He would remain as the majority shareholder and strategic advisor, but the day-to-day management would be handed over to someone prepared, someone who wouldn't sacrifice everything in the name of endless growth. The silence that followed was absolute. "If this is an ultimatum," Ethan concluded, "this is my answer." Outside, the news spread quickly. Stocks fluctuated. Analysts spoke of imminent collapse, others of a rare moment of maturity, but the real impact happened far from there. At school, Laura received a call from the principal. The impromptu investor press conference was already being broadcast. Someone had shown Ethan's speech. She watched the final segment, her hands trembling. That night at home, Emma broke the silence. "Did you choose us?" she asked directly. Ethan knelt before her. "I chose to be here," he replied. "Every day." Lucas approached slowly, and without saying anything, rested his head on his shoulder. The climax was not marked by applause or grand reconciliations, but by something far more difficult: conscious renunciation. The man who built it all finally let go of what he couldn't carry. And in that silent moment, he became exactly who his children needed him to be. The weeks that followed Ethan's decision were marked by a different kind of silence, not the tense silence of before, heavy with uncertainty, but a silence of adaptation, as if everyone were relearning how to occupy the same space with new rules. The company survived, not without losses, not without criticism, but it survived. A new CEO took over, someone Ethan had groomed years before, though he had never actually imagined relinquishing control. The newspapers continued to speculate for a while, but the narrative lost its grip. Scandals need constant conflict to survive, and Ethan had stopped fueling the spectacle. At home, life followed a different rhythm. Laura accepted the position at the school. The stability brought relief, but also pride. For the first time in many years, she felt that her decisions were not merely reactive. She still maintained caution regarding Ethan. Trust, for her, was not an emotion but a process. But she no longer lived defensively. Their relationship matured slowly. There were no hasty romantic promises, nor attempts to erase the past. There were honest conversations, some difficult, others silent. Respect had replaced expectation. With Emma, Ethan discovered the joy of being a role model. He helped with projects, answered complex questions, and learned to say, "I don't know," without discomfort. She began to introduce him naturally as her father, without announcements or ceremony. Lucas changed in a more subtle way. He became more outgoing, less vigilant. He started sleeping through the night. In a drawing he did at school, he depicted 4 people holding hands. He didn't explain. He didn't need to. Ethan observed these changes with a mixture of gratitude and humility. He didn't try to make up for lost time. He had learned that was impossible. Instead, he cared for the present moment with an almost reverent attention. One night, Laura commented, while they were putting away the dishes. "You no longer try to control everything." He smiled slightly. "I learned what truly deserves control." The conclusion didn't bring perfect endings, but it did bring something rarer: coherence. Every choice made from then on reflected who they had become, not who they were trying to prove themselves to be. The past remained part of history, but it no longer dictated the future. 5 years later, Ethan watched Emma adjust the telescope in the backyard, while Lucas ran across the lawn with a dog that was too big for its age. The house wasn't luxurious, nor was it too discreet. It was simply a home. Laura called to him from the doorway, reminding him of dinner. Nothing in that scene would have been possible if he hadn't stopped that day, on that ordinary street, facing an unavoidable truth. Some losses still hurt. Some choices still exacted a price. But for the first time, Ethan didn't measure life by what he had achieved, but by what remained. Stories like this remind us that not all success is visible, and that some of the hardest decisions are the ones no one applauds. But that change everything. If this story touched you in any way, share in the comments what struck you the most or what choice you would have made in Ethan's place. Subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and share this video with someone who needs a reminder that it's never too late to take responsibility, rewrite paths, and choose what truly matters.